Hello class and welcome to Module 4, the Linux overview. So now we're going to jump into some of the good stuff. This is what our VM is a Linux operating system. We went over Windows in the last section as just, kind of keeping you up to date on the bigger distributions, but Linux is where a lot of the work that we're going to be doing is going to be done. Linux distributions are varied. They have lots and lots of different ways that you can deploy Linux, be it, a server, sort of like how we have our Windows home operating system. We have our Windows Enterprise. Linux has enterprise versions. They have standard distributions or home versions, and then they also have server distributions. So Linux is incredibly flexible. When you're working with Linux, you're working with a whole bunch of different companies that typically design their own distributions and then package them up and hand them to you, versus Windows, where you kind of only can go through Microsoft and they kind of have their standard products, enterprise, home, server, etc. So a little more rigid, a little more user-friendly, I would say, but Linux can become very user-friendly, and it actually has made leaps and bounds in terms of, especially the GUIs and stuff. A lot of the Linux operating systems are now pretty indistinguishable to, basic Windows operations. So let's go and jump into it. This will be a bit of a longer um, PowerPoint and lecture because, as you saw with the Windows one, there are a lot of different bells and whistles when it comes to operating systems because everything we're doing is being built upon these. This is what we're going to be interacting with, deploying our tools, etc. So we need to take the time to understand the base level operating of what we're doing before we start moving up and talking about more specific nitty gritty. So let's just go and start. You can see here our objectives and kind of the different sections we're going to go through. So Linux basics, just kind of talking about what is Linux and why is Linux now, but why are the skills essential for us to learn? Linux is a learning curve for those who have never worked with it before, but once you kind of get used to it, you're pretty used to all distributions. It's not really like a big difference, how Mac and Windows is like kind of night and day, even though they are quite similar now. Linux, if you use one distribution, for the most part, you kind of know how to move to the other ones, unless it's like a GUI versus, just console based. But we're going to talk about the shell. That's in both. You pretty much spend most of your time working in the shell. You don't really use the GUI that often, besides maybe just opening an application that has a GUI. Otherwise, when you're actually doing Linux work, it's almost always in the shell. So servers and clients, as I mentioned, they have server distributions. So a lot of Linux machines and a lot of servers you interact with are very likely running on Linux machines just because they're a lot more lightweight and flexible. The Windows server is great and it is very useful in its distribution use cases, but most companies opt for Linux just because they can strip everything away that they don't need and then just get the base bones, whatever their server is running, their web server, etc., and then shove that in a server rack, right? So a lot less space, less computing resources, and less cost, and that's always the bottom line, right? So basic server admin. So we talked about this a little bit in the Windows labs as well, just kind of how to check where your logs are, pretty much what we're grabbing with our source eames, all the good information that you'll use for diagnosing. The file system, we mentioned it briefly in the Windows lecture as well. Linux has its own file system, but it also has NFS, which you can use alongside Windows file systems, and you don't really see a difference as a user, just some of the backend stuff. So working in the GUI, this part will be where you'll get a lot in your labs, pretty much is both the shell and the GUI. Your Linux distribution has a GUI, which just makes it easier and a little less of a difficult transition from just losing the whole GUI and then going straight to a shell-based only. So you'll learn a little more about the GUI, but the most important stuff is really getting used to the shell and trying to, I do recommend if you are navigating through files and stuff, don't use the GUI because it's, similar to Windows. Try to kind of force yourself to like open text files via the shell, move to directories via the shell, because you really want to start kind of getting that a natural progression of your skills, because you're going to have to do lots and lots of tasks in Linux. So you're going to want to be able to be quick on the shell. You don't need to memorize every command. It's okay, but we'll go over some of the commands soon. And then working on a Linux host, use tools to detect malware on a Linux host. So this is where we're finally getting into the, the cyber side. So we got to get all of this, base information, get ourselves ready to jump into Linux, and then we kind of, near the end, we start hinting at what we're going to do for the rest of the class, right? Okay, so let's start with the basics. I'll probably split this lecture similar to the Windows one, just because I understand retention rate. If I start talking for over an hour, you're like, okay, I'm just gonna skip this guy and put him on 4 times speed. So I'll try to break it up as best I can. So stay with me. I know the upcoming checkpoint exam quiz thing is both Windows and Linux. I think that is going to be the hardest one of all of them, just because both Windows and Linux's lectures do have a lot of information. Hopefully the Windows one maybe is a little more familiar to many of you, but I do recommend, I did not want to hit you guys with both the Windows and Linux set of assignments, because as you saw, Module 3, or I guess Part 3 of Module 1 is quite long, the Windows section, just because there's a lot of information, and this one is kind of similar. So I didn't want to have you guys do both of those in week 1. So maybe take a moment before you take the exam and just go through, I put the PowerPoints on Canvas, so you can just go and click through them yourself. That's where a lot of the information will see. And then obviously in the NetAcad class, you can scroll through there. So the exams are, take it twice. I have it as, 2 chances. So hopefully if you're like, oh, I'll try one and see how I do. And then if it doesn't go as well as you want, okay, well, you can take it again. So I try to reduce the stress of the students that way. So you can maybe take it once to see how much you've actually absorbed. And then after that, you buckle down and work on any of the stuff you need to, or maybe holes in your knowledge. So, okay. So what is Linux? As you can see, they've got this nice little penguin here. I love their symbol. This is just like the base Linux symbol. All the different distributions have their own little symbols, but it's an operating system created in 1991. It's open source, fast and reliable, and small. Both these are important, but small is why Linux really shines, is because, again, we're trying to maximize our 3,000 server racks. We would rather have, 300,000 Linux distributions than, we'll say, 150,000 Windows ones, right? So it requires very little hardware resources to run and is highly customizable. We don't often have actual full-on server blades now that are like their own. With virtualization, as you can see with your VMs, a lot of these massive, pretty much servers that split virtually into a whole bunch of different shards that are different Linux distributions, etc. So they're really easy to spin up really quick, meet whatever demand. Maybe there's a lot of connections during the day. Say Amazon's website has a lot of connections during this time and that time. So more server resources will go there. And then during the nighttime, they delete all those shards. And then now it's just, the few that they needed to be running, and they're saving a lot of money and processing power. And it's really incremental, and you have a lot of control about how many process power you're using. So anyway, that is definitely one of the strongest benefits of Linux. Linux is designed to be connected to the network, which makes it much simpler to write and use network-based applications. As I mentioned, a lot of servers are running on Linux. It's definitely the focus of it. It's not just supposed to be an offline user-based thing like Windows Home, where that's kind of their primary bread and butter. Linux is definitely focused on servers and server deployments. So a Linux distribution is the term used to describe packages created by different organizations and include the Linux kernel with customized tools and software packages. So pretty much that means is everyone gets the little penguin guy, the base Linux kernel, and then they build what they want on it. So you'll see in our distribution, it has a lot of tools already, because we're doing cyber things. So Kali Linux has a lot of cyber-based tools already pre-installed and set up, because that is just kind of like the niche of that Linux distribution, but different distributions will have different niches, right? So you don't have to install a whole bunch of stuff from the ground up every time you spin up a new image. So the value of Linux, it's open source, so anyone can acquire it. So there are paid versions of Linux, those distributions that are made by different companies, but anyone can just grab the Linux kernel and build pretty much whatever they want off of it. In this class, we're not going to be building a Linux distribution from the ground up, so don't worry. But it is very available, and even the paid distributions, a lot of them are still open source, but the company kind of does their own internal stuff as well. So it's often the choice of, as we talked about, the SOC, or where we're eventually hoping, some of you security professionals will work. It's very powerful. The CLI is very well made. A lot of the commands that you notice the difference between PowerShell and then just normal CLI on Windows, the admin console, is very limited. The console can't do a lot, it has a lot of functionality, but it's much more limited than, say, PowerShell, right? Linux's CLI is closer to PowerShell in terms of all the different commands and options you're able to do with it, because a lot of distributions for Linux don't have a GUI. They don't have the, click on the different application stuff. Is you got to do it all in the CLI, so it has these kind of functionalities. And the CLI has, it's very easy to add functionalities to it depending on what's on your computer. So you have more control over the OS. I mean, you pretty much go all the way straight down the kernel and then build it from there. Windows has a bunch of stuff locked up, and as I mentioned, there's thousands upon millions of files now in Linux or in Windows, and that comes pre-installed with your home edition, your server edition, whatever. And some of them are hidden. A lot of them are backend stuff Windows doesn't want you messing with or even looking at, versus Linux, where it's like everything is open, everything you can mess with. You might break your system, but that's why we virtualize our Linux distribution, so that when we do break them, we just roll back to a snapshot, right? And then obviously network focus, communication. Often what we're doing is trying to connect servers together and then watching the traffic and doing our distributions so that our entire company can connect to one place and move away information back and forth. So all right, so Linux in the SOC. The flexibility provided by Linux is a great feature for the SOC. The entire operating system can be tailored to become the perfect security analysis platform. Again, if we want one thing, we get it onto our Linux distribution, so we can populate that out to the entire area. We don't need all the extra bells and whistles of Windows. We don't need all the extra stuff downloaded from a certain distribution. We can get the one that has exactly what we want, and it's really easy to deploy once we build it. Kind of when we're done tailoring it, then you can distribute it across your entire SOC. Everyone has their own copy now. Really easy to clone out for virtualization. So Siegel is the cybersecurity analyst console in a special version of Linux called Security Onion. So this is what we have. We're going to use on one of our labs, and this is one of the images that is provided for you. So we're going to mess with this later, but this is just kind of giving you a little preview. So it's open source suite of tools that work together for network security analysis. So ultimately, it's just how we're going to pretty much be watching networks, right? So here are the different tools. I'm just going to very quickly go through this because there's a ton of different tools. I would take a moment to pause me and read these if you want to. So we're capturing network packets. So we're seeing what's going on in our network. We're checking out what malware is on the system, or potentially we'll build a virtualized system, throw the malware in a sandbox, and then watch it with analysis tools to see how it destroys things. IDS, so we're seeing if people are breaking into our network or our computers. Firewalls, we already talked about those before, but pretty much predefined, whitelist, blacklist. You can do this or you cannot do this. They can manage either the network level or the device level. Log managers, logs are great. We'll generate a bajillion of them, but that's why we have log managers, so that they can collate all the information for us, and then we can pull all that into our SIEM and pretty much grab it from all these log managers. So as I mentioned, security information event manager. SIEMs are very common in Linux, and pretty much most SIEMs run on Linux. So there's real-time analysis of alerts from all these log managers, firewalls, and intrusion detection systems. Sometimes the analysis tool, if they're running, like I said, you make a sandbox, and then you have the analysis tool give all of its information. And ticketing system. So this is a task ticket assignment, editing and recording. This is kind of pretty much, we mentioned those 3 levels. The first level of individuals who work in a SOC are going to be the ones who make these tickets, pretty much saying like, this is the problem, this is where it was seen, this is the time it was seen, and here's the log attachment. And then they filter that up to the level 2 guys, and then level 3s if it's needed. So Linux computers that are used in the SOC often contain pen test tools. So sort of like our distribution, we have a lot of pen test tools already in our distribution. So again, you don't need to be downloading all this, configuring all this. When you have the Kali Linux is one of the more popular ones, but when you have your distribution internally, I'm sure they have their own edits they do to some of these bigger distributions at some companies. You get it just right, and then propagate it out to your whole network, and so everyone is working with the same tools, right? So there's lots of great tools. We're going to go through a lot of them in the labs, but we're still going to just be scraping the surface. But we're going to be able to generate packets to kind of do spoofing and seeing our own, we're going to create network traffic and then capture it and see, where the packet's going and kind of test its path, etc., its contents, and then you can see if your encryption's working right. So if you're able to grab a packet and you can read it all plain text, you're like, oh, whoops, my encryption is not working at whatever Linux server or backend you're running. So you can use proof of concept exploits. All of these things are pen test tools that are already on your distribution. Kali Linux is a Linux distribution which contains many pen test tools together in a single Linux. As I mentioned before, it's one of the major cyber guys' go-to distribution. Okay, so we're going to talk about the shell. As I mentioned in the module overview, the shell is kind of where a lot of the magic happens in Linux. The GUI is helpful too, but getting used to the shell is definitely going to be a very valuable tool. When you put on your resume, I know Linux, they're sometimes they do test and they'll watch you maneuver through a Linux system, and they're watching for, okay, can this person go through the CLI, or are they only using the GUI, etc. How well do they know this, the Linux shell? So there are labs that we're going to have you go through this, but I do recommend take like 10 minutes or something, maybe throughout the space of this class, 10 minutes before you start your Linux labs and homework. Just maneuver around, create a file, delete a file, whatever you're doing in the last lab or last lecture, just do it again a few times so that becomes a little more muscle memory, a little more familiar. And I personally found that to really help me when I was going through school and I was going through Linux, because I don't use Linux every day, but it kind of forced me to get used to it. And it does become more second nature, and it actually helps in when I'm doing Windows stuff too, because I'm just using the CLI on Windows or the PowerShell rather than the GUI, which sometimes is not particularly helpful. So in Linux, the user communicates with the OS by using the CLI or the GUI, as I was saying. So it often starts with the GUI and hides the CLI. First thing you pretty much do every time you launch your Linux is open the CLI. One way to access CLI is the terminal emulator application. You've probably already collected if you've installed and checked out your distribution for the other lab, as I mentioned, to add your name or whatever. So the first thing you can do is pop open the CLI and type your name. That's how most people submit that. But anyway, so popular terminal emulators are Terminator, Xterm, eTerm, Xterm, Console with a K, and GNOME Terminal. Fabrice Bellard has created JS Linux, which allows an emulated version of Linux to run in a browser. So this is a very cool, you could practice your Linux in even your Windows browser, right? So these terms are often used interchangeably. You've probably heard me say CLI, terminal, or console, or shell. These are all pretty much they pretty much mean the same thing. The biggest difference is maybe when you're speaking Windows, when you say shell and CLI, CLI normally means the admin console, so the CMD, versus shell is almost always talking about PowerShell, kind of just because it's in the name. Just so if I maybe confuse you or someone else, that's for the most part, people just say console or CLI or whatever, but that difference can matter in Windows more than it does in Linux. Anyway, so here's a GNOME terminal, popular Linux terminal emulator. As you can see here, you've got your user, and then here are some of the commands they ran. We're going to talk about some of these arguments you can add in the commands and what all this stuff means. So basic commands, I'm not going to go through all of these. These will, me just saying them out loud is not going to help you very much. It's definitely why I said take 10 minutes, practice, so that all the commands pretty much on these next two slides become second nature, because these are the ones that I do recommend memorizing. Maybe not exactly, but as many as you can. So go ahead and pause me, but these are all like the commonly used, pretty much day-to-day commands we're going to be using. So feel free to take a second. Sudo is something you run all the time to go up into admin, because you do not want to by default be logged into the admin or root account. It's much better to be in your own user account so you don't accidentally break something. And then you do with purpose, as I mentioned, always do things with purpose. With sudo, you have to actually say, hey, I'm going into the admin privilege realm now, so run this as an administrator rather than as my user. So file directory commands, again, moving through the directory will be much easier when you get familiar with it, but pretty much, ls and cd are your two best friends. It's what you're going to see, where am I, pretty much, and then, okay, where am I trying to go? And then after that, these are just the, you expect copying and moving, removing, and then, looking for certain results, kind of like filtering, kind of if you open Windows Explorer and you type in the search bar, you can use grep in a similar way. So working with text files, one of our labs is going to be doing this because that's generally what you will be doing with Linux. You're going to pop open a text file, you're going to see, a log or whatever, be able to maneuver with it. You're going to be able to configure, a lot of, say, your GitHub configurations will be done in a text file. You'll go to your, global Git options, open it up, change it, close it. Text editors are kind of hand in hand with the CLI in Linux. The ones we're going to be using is mainly Nano. It's kind of like the more popular one, but people have their preferences, and there's a whole bunch of different ones. Of course, if you have one you're already familiar with, there's not a requirement for you to use Nano in this class. You can choose the one you like the most. Some people are like bonded to one text editor over another, so feel free. As long as you're able to edit text, right? So as I mentioned, Nano is a popular command line text editor. It pretty much opens the text in the CLI. And then you're able to change things like so. Here we're seeing firewall rules where we're allowing, movement here, logging here, etc. So the importance of text files in Linux, as I mentioned, everything is pretty much done in a text file. So in Linux, everything is treated as a file. This includes the memory, disk, monitor, and the directories. So you can pretty much touch or edit anything in Linux via a text editor. So config files, again, all in text. So the administrator used the command sudo nano etc host to open the file. I don't know where, I assume that's in the next slide. Let me just open that. So the command sudo super user do, so super user is the way they say administrator, invokes the super user privilege to use the nano text editor to open the host files. So that way when you're editing on these host files, especially these ones in the etc folder, these are like base configuration things. Most of the time you do not have permissions as a user to make edits. You can view, but can't edit. So you sudo launch nano so that you can't actually edit it. So here it is. I don't know why they split that up, but so you can see here are the hosts listed here from that nano command. Okay, so here we go. Finally, first lab. Hopefully not too much talking. I'm trying to move through it so that you can, again, Linux, I can say all the commands to you, but it'll be way better if you're just playing with them yourself. I find that the hands-on learning to be a lot more useful when it comes to, like these day-to-day uses of Linux versus just all the terminology of different kinds of attacks and stuff. That's more lecture focused, right? Okay, so let me pull up the lab. Give me 1 second. So here we are in the lab. It looks a little longer, but I promise you it is not. It's mainly just giving you the output so that you can kind of match to make sure you're doing the right thing. So just go through it. This is pretty much just step-by-step open text, look at the text, and then use Nano to change it a little bit. And then it just lets you go through a few different kind of files and how to move around in it. So this is probably, the most base level lab that we have, but it's also one of the most important because, again, everything's treated as a file. You can open pretty much anything with a text editor. So being familiar with the CLI and text editors is kind of how you can consider yourself, I guess, more proficient in Linux. I did have a question about answering these questions and what kind of answer you need to add. I used to require screenshots of your console. I try not to do that too much because I know it can be annoying in a virtual machine, since most of the time the answer to that screenshot is already listed here. So the only way I can really see that you're engaging with material is answering the questions that crop up here. There aren't that many in this one. I'm not even seeing any out here, right? There's one. Because again, we just generally want you to be stepping through the material and engaging with it. So I'd rather, you don't need to worry too much about giving me this like super specific answer to any of these. Just this as simple as possible. It doesn't even have to be a full sentence. Like this, why is the prompt not shown in the terminal? You could just give me like a quick blurb as to your answer. Whatever you feel like is appropriate to get the answer across. I don't really want to be too hard on grading that. I just rather you engage with the material and actually go through these labs because this is the best part of this course is all of the hands-on experience that you can actually bring into an interview conversation and practice. All right, so now go back to lecture. Actually, it's just another lab, so let me go and pull up the lab, and I'll end the video after doing the lab explanation to kind of give you guys a break and so you can hop in and mess with the shell here in the CLI. So let me open the second lab. All right. So pretty much the same thing as the last one is it's just going to have you step through here and mess with the shell a bit. And then again, 1-2 word answers here. This is generally just making sure you're following along and are where you're supposed to be. That's generally what these questions are for. So don't, again, get too caught up on writing me an essay here, right? Just enough to get the answer across. And then after that, again, you just go step through and finish the reflection. So I'm going to close the video out here, breaking this lecture up. These are kind of getting your feet wet with Linux. In the future, and the next few parts of the lecture, we're going to dive a little more into the use cases of Linux. So a little more information heavy, but still hopefully helpful. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions.